Greetings and welcome. Welcome to the Joko this evening. I'm Brother Youssef. I'm here, going to spend the next hour or so with you, chatting with my partner, Tasha. Good evening, Tasha.
Good evening, Brother Youssef. And let me remind you to make your proper
My
presentation.
proper, well, yes, I
Introduction.
am a poet, a professor, cultural studies scholar, and a member of the Joko for however long the Joko has been Jokoing now, 10 years, something like
Yeah,
that. Yes,
right?
more or less. Yeah, um, that's right. Because I was at the very first Joko, though as a member of the audience at that night. So
Mhm.
anyway, yes, that's right. How about you?
So my best presentation is as I like the way Brother James referred to me in our Sunday programming, comrade sister. That's
Hmm.
good. Okay. I can use comrade. Um and concerned sister in the community, concerned
Hmm.
sister in the community. I think that it's sometimes a medium is the message, and I feel like my medium is that there are ways we come to thinking about society and improving society and
Hmm.
the push for
Excuse
liberation
me. Are
that
you
aren't,
hearing an echo?
huh? I don't
No,
hear the
no, it's gone now. I'm
I don't
sorry.
hear the echo. Ways that we come to um, this, you know, this
Hmm.
work, this way of this worldview of analyzing society that's not always through institutions, that there
Hmm.
are ways, these ideas and this mode. We do this at the kitchen table, right?
Hmm.
And so I'm a product of the kitchen table. And um, without having all of kind of the forms and the background that is very important um, in that tradition, in our intellectual tradition, as I bring that in, I also respect and recognize that the ideas and the concepts and the questions that I have learned to ask in life came from listening to um, Black folk,
Hmm.
a lot of Black women sit around and talk in a beauty salon at
Hmm.
a time when Black people were definitely looking at society. I'm a product of the time, born in 1968. Um, so I am a concerned sister, and someone who feels like, has the audacity to think there's something um, to that I have to contribute to the conversation and just getting involved in the conversation about how we um, go about creating an actual better world. So yes, that is me. Um, and with that, um, I will do our
Thank you for
usual,
taking the time.
huh?
Thank you for taking the time,
Yes, okay.
to do
Thank you
that.
for asking.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, so that being said, our usual invocation. We, of course, are here um, primarily to talk about the um, bid of African peoples all over the world for um, liberation from the downpresser. We know who we are. We know what we're talking about. And we recognize that as we do the work to liberate ourselves, we in fact generate all kinds of ideas, concepts, models of resistance um,
Mhm.
that aid the people of the world in also liberating themselves. And we remain in conversation and comparison and solidarity with other oppressed peoples. Um, and in so doing, to be a proper member of that community of solidarity, we acknowledge and uh, uplift and all of those popular words. Um, the power, right? We do our power acknowledgement for the indigenous peoples of this turtle island, um, whose ancestors and who they themselves, we do this work at their hospitality and the grace of those spirits that are embedded in the ethers of this land, and we recognize and acknowledge that.
Yes.
And even as we grow in real time, substantial relationship building with those elements of the indigenous community that are about sovereignty and liberation. Um, and that's all.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate it for, besides the spirit, and the political education that you bring, just on the practical side. As per our most recent meeting with Tandi, as you and I are, neither of us are media professionals, media trained, right? I have media as an area of academic study, right? But that's not
Hmm.
doing media, right? As such, right?
Hmm.
So, you know, we created the notification, the YouTube and the Facebook notification, but nothing else. And so that gave me the time to send out on Instagram that we are live, right?
Right.
So that those who follow Joko Collective on Instagram and follow my personal, and really I got to start using your personal because for some reason it's in my phone. Um, but I think Joko probably covers, anyway. No, we
Yeah.
better start using the third one too.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's why I appreciated that because that gave me time to do that, right? When I'm looking down, trying to
Yeah.
go very quickly to get the message out that we're live because yeah, we aren't media people, including social media people, and I yeah, I'm a late adopter, right? Mid 20th century, late 20th century, mid 20th century born, late 20th century raised in adulthood, and as the
Mhm.
world became digital, right? But
Yes.
uh, coming along with it, so
I quote my girl, analog girl in a digital world.
digital world, right? And it's
Yes.
that right. Anyway, so wanted to get that word out, right?
Yeah.
Um, a little bit, for folks to come in. The But yeah, we decided to look at, just begin discussing this attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Um, what that even means, right? The way it's being used as a sort of a catch-all. The way recently critical race theory used as a catch-all. Um, just the latest version of backlash that has been
Mm.
since the Reconstruction era, right? Really, one long um, era, of backlash, one backlash after another, and that really it's not just a racial backlash.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but really a backlash against I think the language
Mhm.
that I put in the description or at least in the title that would go out on the notification. Oh, there it is. To roll back modernity, right? A backlash
Mm.
against modernity in a very real way. um that is intensified, particularly in this country, not this country alone, but particularly in this country, which is
Mhm.
significant. This is the center of the empire, right? The metropole, to use that language, of a global, of the global empire of the West, right? The capitalist West. The So yeah, that, and to bring in these other things, though, again, starting with race, because actually that's what they've started with in a very, fundamental way.
Mhm.
They being the current administration, right? The Trump
Mhm.
administration as
Mhm.
it's come in, and as
Mhm.
we recognize what is meant by diversity, equity, and inclusion is not in and of itself a pathway to liberation, but it's at least about making the society we live in a little more humane. Um, Simply put, right, a little more
Mhm.
humane. That
Mhm.
people a chance to
Mhm.
reproduce life and gain
Mhm.
skills, that can
Mhm.
help reproduce life and even help build a nation. Um,
Mhm.
anyway,
Mhm.
so we have a video queued up to get us started on the discussion. But before we jump to it, any comments that you want to make or share before?
I think that really just the respect, as you're saying, folks who are more radical minded, um, at least, and revolutionary minded, um, understand that these civil rights reforms,
Mm-hmm.
um, are not a pathway to actual liberation, um, but that they are an important, and have become, this important symbol of respecting the plurality of a cosmopolitan
Mm-hmm.
society, which is also a feature of the modern society,
Mm-hmm.
because of
Mm-hmm.
that same imperialism and colonialism and the
Mm-hmm.
bringing together of all of, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And um, it also militates against that brutality of maintaining the white supremacist order, in just,
Mm-hmm.
kind of uh, inserting this kind of factual, not it's not a new factual, it's a already always been a factual, but the suppressed
Mm-hmm.
story that we always talk about, resting on the invisibilization of all others but the white male and or the nuclear family
Mm-hmm.
headed by the white male, and this kind of,
Mm-hmm.
that representation. So it has very important symbolic value, in addition to what we understand is relatively meager material value. But
Mm-hmm.
it's important, since we've been talking about the imagination, it creates important space in the imagination, in addition to expanding, as you always say, that expanding that democratic space, in
Mm-hmm.
important ways. So just that, just that,
Okay.
before we dig into it.
Well, yeah. So let's go ahead and share the video, and I don't think we need to share the whole video, but up until the point about where we watched it.
Hmm.
It's only 7 minutes, so I think we end up watching
It's
about
good.
five of that, 4 or 5. But and this is Tom Hartman, right? So
Hmm.
anyone watching this, can go to Tom Hartman's page, right, and watch it, or listen to the podcast version, radio version of the Tom Hartman program. And I believe this was from yesterday. This particular um, discussion that he has, or actually analysis that he offers, report even, and really of what's coming, and what is in office, what sector of the U.S. state, the
Hmm.
U.S. civil society, right, of
Hmm.
the ruling class, which sector of the ruling class has been empowered in a particular way, and again in this this open rule of billionaires,
Mm-hmm.
who are ruling, blatantly in their own interest, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
still somehow
Mm-hmm.
rhetorically trying to make it sound like it's in the interest of the nation at large. The
Mm.
But just what is motivating, what has always so deeply motivated, right? American identity, American, the U.S. practice of capitalism, right? And which really the practice of capitalism around the world, right? But this very
Mm-hmm.
particular, U.S. version of racialized capitalism, or yeah, and even the idea of what people mean, are getting at with the term racialized capitalism, and why they
Mm-hmm.
can't really be separated in an analysis of these modern capitalist societies and
Mm-hmm.
position they got us in. Let me see. That's what I want to share. Yes, that right there. Sound is ready. Okay, so here's Tom Hartman, and let's go. Do we need all that? What happens if I do that? Yeah, there we go. That's better.
Trump official declared competent white men must be in charge. Yeah. Darren Beattie is Trump's State Department is hiring his first-term speechwriter, a guy by the name of Darren Beattie, for a top job. Just 15 weeks. This is by Tommy Christopher, by the way, over at Mediaite. Just 15 weeks after he submitted that, quote, competent white men must be in charge in a tweet. Semaphore broke the news that Marco Rubio is going to appoint him as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. He was fired from the last Trump administration for speaking to a conference of white nationalists. Some weeks ago, apparently, he wrote, quote, competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work. Unfortunately, our entire national ideology is predicated on coddling the feelings of women and minorities and demoralizing competent white men. I'm telling you, these people know what they're doing. They are trying to make America white again. They're trying to bring America back to where only white men are in charge. And this is why a majority of white men and a majority of white women voted for Donald Trump in the last election. It's real simple. It's about race. It's about power. Darby Saxby, a professor of psychology at the University of Southern California, shared a leaked list of words. Now, this is the National Science Foundation. And I subscribe to Nature, and I'm a member of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And so I get these, emails, and the scientific community is just hysterical right now. And here's why. If you have submitted an application for funding for research that you're doing, and it has words in it like systemic or women, I'll give you the whole list. And this is Darby Saxby. He writes, this is a crisis for science. These keywords could show up in the text of any grant involving human participants. If you're going to study men and women, you get flagged. If you say you're going to control for socioeconomic status, which is a totally standard practice, you get flagged. Disability, flagged. The word systemic is on the banned list. So if I study systemic inflammation and health, I get flagged. If I study political science, flagged. If I study trauma, flagged. And so here's this list, and I'm only going to share a little bit of it with you. Advocacy, barriers, biased, Black and Latinx, community diversity, cultural differences, culturally responsive, disabilities, disability, discrimination, diverse backgrounds, diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, equality, equitable, ethnicity, female. If the word female is in your grant application, you don't get funded. Gender. If hate speech is in your application, you don't get funded because, of course, the Trump administration is just down with hate speech. Fine thing. Hispanic, implicit bias, inclusion, indigenous, inequality, LGBT, marginalized, minorities, multicultural, prejudice, race, ethnicity, racial diversity, racial inequality, racial justice, racism, If you're studying racism, your grant just got zeroed out. Sexual preferences, social justice, status, trauma, underserved, underrepresented, undervalued, victim, women. I mean, this is crazy. And they sent out this whole decision tree about, you look for these words. If you find these words, boom, you bounce them. Meanwhile, federal health workers are terrified after this website, it's called the DEI Watch List, is publishing the names and pictures and personal information of federal employees who are involved in the health field. People who go out and do vaccinations, or people who are, working for the VA or whatever. I mean, it's just, and interestingly, they call it the DEI watch list. Interestingly, almost all of the names and pictures on this website are of Black people. Once again, it's the racism, stupid. Offenses include working on DEI initiatives, donating to Democrats, or using pronouns in their bios. A government worker said the website is being circulated among multiple private group chats of federal health workers across agencies, as well as through social media links. People are freaked out. They're terrified. The headline over these pictures of these mostly Black people on this DEI watch list of the federal employees, the headline used to say targets. They changed that yesterday when it got publicized to say dossiers. A person who isn't on the list but works at a federal health agency called the website psychological warfare. The link, this person said, is being circulated in their private group of federal health workers, causing some to freak out, you think. A note at the bottom of the website says, a project of the American Accountability Foundation. This is one of the so-called conservative watchdog groups. This article over at NBC News notes, quote, it's not the first time the group has created such a list. In December, it sent Pete Hegseth, then the nominee for defense secretary, a list of names and people in the military whom it deemed too focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, the New York Post reported at the time. Meanwhile, the CIA has sent a buyout offer to its entire workforce. Work for the CIA? Hey, how'd you like to quit your job? Russia would love it. Vladimir Putin would be so.
So I think we can stop there.
Mm-hmm.
To
Mm-hmm.
that's what we needed to write. Is on our point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To open this discussion up, right, and it's almost so astounding. Almost don't have words for it in the moment, right? But particularly, and you've heard me, and I don't think I'm the only one, right? Make the point about the number of Black people, other people employed by the federal government, and really at all levels, right? I mean, people aren't thinking about all the various departments of a federal building, right? Just maintaining the building, right? Forget whatever the agencies may be within the building. The the anti-Blackness, right? Fuels some of that anti-federal government business, at least since again the post-Civil War period, right? The federal government coming in to be a buffer, right, between and a poor buffer at that, right? But a buffer between African Americans, other racialized groups, colonized groups in the United States, most specifically and prominently the indigenous people, the First Nations, right? With agencies like the Federal Bureau of or what they call it, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? And the Office of the Interior or whatever, right? Department of the So that animosity being there, and then that extending out, right, to all these other various ways in which groups, constituencies of people, racialized communities, so socio-economic classes, laborers, women, etc., right, need federal intervention, or just the general population, right? Needs federal intervention. Go ahead.
Right. It's interesting how much of this rides on perception. It's observable how much of this rides on perception and is a manipulation. It's identifiable, as Hartman just said, this is about race. It's about race. Yeah, well, Tom, we've been saying it. And on your programs, I've listened to Tom Hartman regularly, before it was just so undeniable. He was one of those liberal, folk that was, well, is it really this? Is it really that? It's a number of things. It's not. It's as a tool of manipulation, because the first, well, maybe not the first, but I think maybe the first like kind of shock blow kind of big deal was the overturning of Roe versus Wade, right? But just in terms of this drama, and the perception, yeah, the notion of DEI, meaning Black people, unqualified Black people get ahead, rather than the reality, the oft-cited reality that the biggest beneficiaries of diversity and inclusion and affirmative action have been white women, that this kind of reinforces the piece that this is so much about a play on the psychology, the psychology of white supremacy, and the these notions of you're not advancing, the explaining to the lower class white that your lack of social mobility is due to someone else taking your place, these kinds of notions. But yeah, meanwhile, a number of prominent white women, right, in the military have lost their positions, and Black women, and just being summarily dismissed, and yeah, right. So, and all of this also, along with the CRT phraseology and the CRT buzz phrase or whatnot, have so little to do with the actual the reality of how this work, these policies, these kinds of structures, the DI framework is implemented and what it addresses. I think as we were talking Sunday, the point that so much of what's indicated in the 2025 Project 2025 about the DEI, and so much of where diversity inclusion refers to ability, how many folks are benefiting from that framework based on various physical ability, right? And which was clear.
DEI and DEIA.
Right. But yeah, but again, not a real, it's not real, it's all about perception, perception and performance, but as in that really obnoxious response to the
What's not real?
plane collision that DEI refers, that it's DEI,
yeah,
and it
the
refers
way
to
the
Black
way that they're
people,
employing it.
the
Yes, I see
perception,
your
yeah,
point.
rather than what is,
Yeah,
right?
the way that it has
Measurably.
been framed and made to stand in for. And again, right, taking the place of what was CRT, and then affirmative action, reverse racism. These, it's the latest buzzword to capture,
Right. The
all
sentiment.
rights. And indeed,
Yeah.
it's sort of a kind of like affirmative action. Always, really, sort of always means race first, but can encompass, every grievance, right?
Right. And as you brought us all the way back to the Reconstruction, the reaction against Reconstruction, and
Yeah.
all of the representation of Black governance,
Mhm,
being this governance of fools, and just
mhm.
all of this kind of thing. Um, and just the, that uh panic,
Yeah.
the panic,
Mhm,
generating panics.
mhm.
It's also very interesting, strategically, just in terms of the strategic discourse, anti-trans in particular, anti uh, gender non-conforming, anti non what anti non-heteronormative. I'm not trying to get into a lot of weird verbal constructions, but that has been such um, the rallying cry, the rallying piece, for the, again, to bring in larger swaths of the mainstream public, not white folk who are already identified with the values
Mhm.
and principles of what's now just being, commonly understood as white nationalism and Christian nationalism. Um, but yeah, um, this is all very, kind of interesting. And then this blanket, um, the targeting, that targeting piece, um, which is being done all over, and uh,
Well, yeah, exactly. That targeting piece and the very specific,
yeah.
prominence of Black federal employees, right, and being, called targets and then called out, and now they're dossiers. But that was the point I, distracted myself from about the, speaking about federal workers earlier. That this is one of the motivating forces, or motivating animus for Timothy McVeigh, right? How many Black people were working in that Oklahoma City building, right? How many of their children were in the child care?
Mm-hmm.
This, and how is that going to affect the employment numbers, right? I mean, there's so many ways in which, right? The repercussions for Black folks, what many folks, certainly in Washington, is
Mm-hmm.
an important part of constituting the Black bourgeoisie,
Mm-hmm.
historic Black
Mm-hmm.
establishment, um, in that region in particular. But there are also those, again, throughout the country, right? People work in federal buildings, right? Federal offices, and that's going to have a major impact. And
Mm-hmm.
that it does again highlight, right? What forces have been unleashed, um, given the power of the state, um, and haven't been given that power, in after the fact, right, of their, let's say, outing, right, as full on white nationalist, white Christian nationalist, um, regressive, on in terms of gender relations and etc. Right.
Mhm.
So I also
Mhm.
find it quite interesting, maybe in a Handmaid's Tale kind of irony,
That's
that
exactly where my head
most
was.
local spokespersons, for
Yes.
this return is the press secretary
Yes.
and the new attorney general, who's
Mhm.
promising to go after the prosecutors, who were doing
Mhm.
their job, following orders,
Mhm.
and who also, bear a certain resemblance to each other. I mean, you might say that folks have a type.
Mhm.
The So I find it quite interesting.
Mhm.
These federal employees, right, are
Mhm.
going after and being the face of, right, and
Absolutely.
the arm of,
Yeah.
um, the attack.
Yeah.
But as we were saying, and really, we just wanted to kind of jump off with, it's the racism, um, and really how straightforward it is, though, right?
Mhm.
The But that it's more than that, right? It is
Yes.
the attack, right? It is not just a rollback of,
Yes.
you know, uh, uh, racialized relations and racial hierarchies,
Mhm.
um, but
Mhm.
all hierarchies, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The right, I guess that is the central, if what was one of the, I'm going to find this title, um the rollback of the 20th century.
Hmm.
Is that the
Hmm.
title of the article? Let me find the
Yeah.
article. I'm
Which
going
and
to
it that itself is a quotation from someone.
it's
Um,
a
Go
it's a
ahead.
quote it's a quotation from, let's see, or at least one place this is was published, or it's on the website Common Dreams, um and first published in 2003, right? The Grider article.
Hmm.
Yes.
Hmm.
Rolling back the 20th century, and is that not the characteristic of the 20th century? The change in labor power, labor and capital relations, the change in racial
Hmm.
hierarchy relations, the change in gender hierarchy
Hmm.
relations, and opening up at
Yeah,
each stage, yeah, these kinds of whole fields of inquiry.
yeah. And really, and it's the 20th century, right? Because even these changes, right? This opening up, is emerging out of, forces that are underway in the 19th century, and the emergence of the progressive movement, right? Or what
Mhm,
historically is called the progressive movement, in the U.S. And from that point, right? The corporations, wanting to get a hold of that. Um, the what this has been called the second Gilded Age, right? And that
mhm,
perhaps we've even been in the second Gilded Age for the last 20 years, if not,
mhm,
30. The
mhm,
but here again, right? We've reached this point of the open rule of the billionaires, the open rule of the robber barons, right? The new robber
mhm,
barons,
mhm,
tech robber barons,
mhm,
the fossil fuel robber barons,
mhm,
the water robber barons, right?
mhm,
These folks, the that they have been struggling mightily against, the progressive movement,
mhm,
the growing of the public sector,
mhm,
as a bulwark against, the worst ravages of capital, and certainly doing anything and everything in their power to keep power out
Mm-hmm.
of the hands of workers, right? Out of the hands
Mm-hmm.
of the workers, out of the
Mm-hmm.
hands of the present of the peasants.
Mm-hmm.
Is not just seize the commons, but
Mm-hmm.
destroy the idea that there should
Mm-hmm.
be a
The
commons.
commons. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But knowing that they're coming up against, right? They're coming up against the Bolshevik Revolution, right? They're coming up against unions and the trade union movement,
Mm-hmm.
and so doing everything in their power to wrest back that power that had been, wrested from them bit by bit, right? Bit, fingernail by fingernail,
Right.
through self-liberating, right, and
Yes.
period in the eras of enslavement, right, and burning the fields when that became
Yes.
necessary,
Mm-hmm.
in Caribbean moments, and not uploading or not unloading the cotton, right? Welsh workers being in solidarity with the enslaved in the Americas, right? And it took all of that, and battling Pinkerton, um, officers or Pinkerton thugs, right? And to win concessions, to win the
Mm-hmm.
5-day week, right? The 8 hour or the
Mm-hmm.
8 hour day, right? To win
Mm-hmm.
those, to win paid
Mm-hmm.
vacations and sick leave, and to
Mm-hmm.
to move. And then it still takes two, what we conventionally call two world wars, and many historians are now saying really should be understood as one war in two phases,
Mm-hmm.
and really being a war to redistribute the
Mm-hmm.
colonies, right? That being really what it was about. That introduces the United States as the new world hegemon, coming out of those two major conflicts. And so, yeah, the power got wrested from them, right? Got wrested from them
Mm-hmm.
in the 30s, in the 40s, and even in the 50s, right? Even with the emergence of the national security state, there's, they still couldn't just take it all away at once, right? There still was not the political will, even in the Ike years, right? There's still like some incredibly high corporate tax rate that we would love to have now,
Mm-hmm.
right? In the
Mm-hmm.
conservative Eisenhower
Mm-hmm.
years, right? So this is everything they've been pulling back, and everyone you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, right? All the various um, groups, peoples open to exploitation,
Mm-hmm.
clawing and fighting for freedom,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
to wrest away what we
Mm-hmm.
could.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, since the mid 1960s, they, the right, certainly the U.S. right and the global right, really, have been, planning
Mm-hmm.
and, long game planning,
Mm-hmm.
for this take back,
Mm-hmm. And
right? And
studying,
rollback.
researching, and
Mhm,
yeah, and trying and attempting, and
mhm,
come this way, come that way. Just, yeah,
mhm,
a kind of a concerted effort where whereas I think that, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the relationship between the public education and the loss of this memory of
mhm,
resistance, the
mhm,
ability, the capacity to train away from the memory of this resistance feature that is happening all the time, um, and with every group, right?
mhm,
And the role, I'm going to say the role that public education, and I know that we wanted to touch on that a bit tonight, plays into it, but it's not, only that, because even
mhm,
as you're talking, yeah, there's quite a bit that's omitted, you know, but yet there's quite a bit I'm thinking about, history texts that I see. going into K through 12 schools, particularly, high schools where they're doing the, world history, American history, et cetera, and government. And these things are mentioned, you'll see mention, you'll see the term robber baron, you'll see, what I mean, a lot of these mentions. Now, some of that might be at this point still a holdover from the curriculum of inclusion era in terms of how well certain things are covered, how well certain ideas are developed in texts that are being used by students now. But the question being, how is it? Yeah, what other kind of factors that affect that memory, that memory status, come in so that these ideas aren't put together. They don't become a topic of conversation. They don't have to, you know what I mean? It's something that is, in the text, but not understood, kind of like scientific concepts, right? And so it's interesting, so we ask ourselves, and we talk about it all the time, but how is it that something can be right before you and yet you don't see it? How does that work? And it's that cultivation of that anti-intellectual culture, and the in movies, in
blind spots can be cultivated.
Because there is no memory. Now, this is not something that you see, that I've seen in textbooks. You don't see, how the 8-hour day was arrived at. That's not actually discussed. You don't see a lot about factory workers and working conditions and child labor laws. You don't see that story. You certainly don't see stories of that talk about those movements and those you don't see anything about coal miners rebellions, and you don't see
And
that.
these are the conventional history books in the classrooms, at least in LA Unified and nearby districts. Over some years now.
And these are absolutely key things to understand. So that just kind of digress.
And to understand with some depth, right? And helping students understand how we have arrived at the place where we are, and even why they enjoy or don't enjoy, certain aspects of their life. They're particularly high school students who may have jobs, right? And, not understand exactly why some of their, older, workmates are getting 38 hours a week, but not 40.
And it's not in the public discussion. It's not in the public discourse. We are absolutely, as an American culture, and that's all inclusive, every group, much more likely to be discussing an entertainment or a celebrity, an event in a celebrity's life, what have you, then then certainly the political changes in the country, locally, and certainly in the world, which we actually, those things are increasingly beyond the collective grasp, as your background picture talks about with the literacy brigades. There's such a need for that, as people are becoming increasingly aware, and it's really entering the discourse, the problem of low literacy in the dramatically low literacy in the American
Mhm.
population.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, this all of this DEI work, it's like, what to when you're putting, what you're putting in where. So now they're ready to show, you know, the black faces and
Mhm.
make these direct attacks,
Mhm.
whereas they, so they feel themselves quite empowered to do so
Mhm.
while in the last week some very
People who
dramatic.
people are receiving death threats, right?
Absolutely.
And many are receiving death threats from the very people who have been recently pardoned.
Right. 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 Absolutely. And all of this removal of federal oversight,
Hmm.
all of these well,
So these are important
there it
areas
is.
again that people don't necessarily think about, or have been in place for so long that they're becoming taken for granted, right? I mean, the things that were being put in place in the first Roosevelt administration, right? The Teddy Roosevelt
Mhm.
administration.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, I don't know that schools are still teaching
Hmm.
Upton Sinclair's The
Mm.
Jungle, right?
I haven't seen it in a
To
long time.
understand, right. I not since the 70s have I seen it. Now I have to say also, as an English teacher and a teacher of literature, I haven't taught it, right? So
Mhm.
because I'm teaching other novels, but I also
Mhm.
don't see, I don't see students walking around with it either.
No.
And
Mm-mm.
I haven't seen I didn't see any of my children bring it home,
Okay.
as high school students, right?
Mhm.
Um, so people don't understand, they're so used to seeing,
Mhm. Mhm.
USDA inspected,
Mhm.
not fully
Mhm.
understanding,
Mm.
everything that means,
Right.
even with the shortcomings and corruption that, all agencies have to, we all live with contradictions. And so certainly, people in these agencies are going to live with contradictions. But
Mhm.
nonetheless, right, the
Mhm.
overwhelming safety
Mhm.
of the US food supply,
Right.
whether on the back end it's the healthiest for you. One can eat healthy if one
Right.
makes some conscious choices,
Right.
because that could have been taken for granted, that the food has gone through a process to ensure it's at least at some fundamental level safe. And if it
Right.
isn't, there's some
Right.
kind of redress and process, right, to
Right.
solve
Right.
the problem.
Right.
And in so many areas, right,
Yes.
this kind of
Yes.
the meaning of regulation.
Yes. Yes. And that anti-regulation discourse, um, it stretches back at least to the Reagan era. To
At
my
least.
memory,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in terms of, and then that for me puts me at what, 12, 13,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
maybe even more relevant because that means as a young person hearing this language and this terminology and the discussion of regulation,
Yeah.
deregulation,
Yeah.
indicates, because I certainly wasn't pursuing that
Yeah.
information. I wasn't reading it. I wasn't, so I would have gotten it from TV,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Um, and so uh, this, what is it, gradual, deliberate, persistent
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
creation of an antagonism
Mm-hmm.
with regulation,
Yeah.
and the forming through the discourse of the relationship between regulation and job availability, you know,
Mm-hmm.
as
Yes.
people are beginning to suffer as this tide is beginning to turn from a period of relative
Mm-hmm.
abundance and quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote social mobility, and people are beginning to feel losses and of various kinds, and or
In
um
in the context of a emerging neoliberalism, that is
Exactly.
shipping these jobs
Exactly.
to exploitable communities overseas, right?
Exactly.
Or over the
Exactly.
border.
Exactly. And as people are beginning to feel it, we get these notions, these popular that are popularized, because that's important to this,
Mm-hmm.
of this whole, what was it, voodoo economics, as it
Mm-hmm.
was called with Reagan, or
By
the
Bush,
trickle down economics.
by George W. Bush, or rather
Voodoo
George
economic.
H.W. Bush. Bush
Okay.
one
I was
was the
okay.
one who used during the primary, right? Said that
Okay.
what you're calling is voodoo economics.
Economics.
And
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. But certainly with Reagan, the trickle down
Mm-hmm.
economics, the trickle down theory,
Mm-hmm.
that so many
Mm-hmm.
people who were, dry as hell accepted, as some kind of new notion, not at all a new notion, but again, there's no collective memory of social conditions that allows people to measure and evaluate, oh, this
And
trickle down
because
economic bullshit. Yeah,
that economic hurt people are feeling is
yeah.
deflected onto others, right? They're the
Mhm,
problem. The so-called
mhm.
welfare queens are the problem.
Absolutely.
Who corporations are taxed too high. That's the problem. They can't
Problem.
hire you.
Yes.
The
Ah,
Japanese are the problem, right? Because
yes.
they don't compete fairly or whatever, right?
Which
There's
is
always
right.
the communists are taking over Central America. This is the problem.
Problem.
This is why your life is your life prospects is shrinking. It has nothing to do with
Yes.
my policies that encouraged the Rust Belt and made sure a whole bunch of people were put out of jobs and went about
Yeah. Yeah.
you know uh, uh, destroying the union movement as best it
Right.
could and implementing 2/3 of the Heritage Foundation's mandate for
Yeah.
leadership.
Yeah.
One of which was the importance of reducing the regulatory function of government in the name of business freedom.
What was
Um,
Michael Moore's film? One of the
which
first, I
one?
think, the one of the first
Medical one or
that were
the
popular.
no?
One of the first popularized.
Roger and Me.
That's it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Roger and Me, and
Yeah.
and
And
Flint.
talks about that decay and living
Yeah.
through that economic decay. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off, but just to.
Well, I think one of the things. Well, I think in thinking about the Reagan administration, or even just that
Hmm.
period.
Hmm.
The 10 years leading up to Reagan.
Hmm.
I don't. I don't think that there's even a full appreciation for how young some of these regulatory agencies are.
Hmm.
Something like the Environmental Protection Agency, right? This
Hmm.
comes out of the Nixon administration. And because of,
Hmm.
not because of the progressivism of the Nixon administration, but because of
Hmm.
the mood of the country, right? And
Hmm.
the demands of the population at that
Hmm.
time, right? Nixon was forced to, at least follow through on, a couple of these progressive measures, but that was because of a democratically held Congress that was and a Democratic Party that at a time when the Dixiecrats were becoming the Republican-crats and the corporatist, the out and out corporatist had not fully taken over the Democratic Party, right? And particularly the financial sector of the
Hmm.
class.
Hmm.
So there's still some hangers on from the New Deal era and and certainly the Great Society era, right? There's still some hangers on. But my point being,
Hmm.
these aren't very old
Right.
necessarily, right? The
Right.
EPA is not
Right.
is not really that old. Um,
Right.
the OSHA, and I just
Yes.
saw something that they're talking about, eliminating federal OSHA,
Yes.
and that might have even been the Reagan administration that OSHA
Mm-hmm.
So these are,
Certainly a lot of cutbacks. Yeah.
these are very recent regulatory
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
people already take for granted, right?
Right. Right.
And what is that world going to be? What is
Right.
our world going to be without the regulation? Fracking is already problematic. What is it
Yeah.
going to be without regulation
Yeah.
in under a presidency that chants drill, baby, drill, despite
Yeah.
climate science?
Yeah.
But then it's also an administration that openly rejects science that is inconvenient. Because it doesn't openly reject science, right? It
Right.
loves whatever Elon Musk represents in terms of science, right?
Exactly. And I was thinking about that, the other day, that contradiction
Hmm.
between this lauding and this kind of
Who is not a
idolizing,
scientist?
right, who is not a scientist, but his what is it, his cachet,
Hmm.
his right, uh
Yep.
his press, right? And
Hmm.
really, I'm gonna even call it his press. It's the
But it is his
popular,
brand, his branding, very
his
much.
branding, his the popular perception
Hmm.
of Musk, right? Um his his costume,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
is well, genius, because, and
Hmm.
that's an automatic American thing. Any wealthy person is attributed with these,
Yeah,
with these prodigious
somehow being a
qualities,
genius. Yes.
particularly genius,
Yes.
um, and part of that deification
Hmm.
of the wealthy,
Yep.
and particularly
Yep.
of the
God's on earth.
white, yes, particularly of the wealth, the figure of the wealthy white male,
Hmm. Hmm.
so yeah, there's all of this love of, or this projection about space travel and Mars exploration and all of these things, and this notion that he's some kind of uh particularly he in particular is some kind of genius, and or what comes with that is the lauding of the Silicon Valley tech bro culture and all that kind of stuff. The um uh what is the word, um defaming of China in a continuum, like you were saying with Japan, it was the same. They're somehow cheating. They're kind of, which
Hmm.
is part and parcel of the cunning Asian trope.
Hmm.
What I'm saying, because so what do you
Yep.
do with, what I'm
And
saying?
their inscrutability.
The inscrutable, you're right? The inscrutable, devious Asian,
Yes.
and all of that. And so now, right, the notion that China, the popularization of the notion that China has stolen American technology, and they're, somehow unlawfully, whatever, right? Which is a notion that you hear. So juxtaposed with this very, with the very anti-science modality of, the QAnon group,
Hmm.
the folks who are, equating
Hmm.
Trump with, see him as some kind of messiah, if not a
Hmm.
messiah. You know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? So it's actually kind of interesting the way these things turn up and play off of each other as just contradictory elements of American myth, and
Hmm.
the way we are creatures of mythology,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
much more so than rationality, But yeah, that part. Um, okay, go ahead.
Well, we shouldn't underestimate. I mean, as you're talking about that, and particularly the animosity toward modern science, right? The
Yes,
science as it has developed
yes,
since
that's where you were.
the mid 19th century, And
Yeah.
certainly this, the anti-evolution um,
Yes.
school, if
Yes.
I hesitate to
Yeah.
call it, or
It is.
the kind of compromise that is
Mm-hmm.
creationism that tries to
Mm-hmm.
make the kind of academic argument. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, this fundamental anti-science
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
is particularly
Mm-hmm.
focused on questions of the creation
Mm-hmm.
of the universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even asserting a notion of a creation, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
um, wants to see the looks at the Big Bang
Mm-hmm.
theory not as a
Mm-hmm.
scientific theory that is
Mm-hmm.
rooted in empirical evidence based on scientific
Mm-hmm.
research in physics and astrophysics, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is developed over over a century now,
Mm-hmm.
but as only
Mm-hmm.
as another creation myth, right? It is, and
Mm-hmm.
it is another creation myth and not the true one, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
only the biblical story is true, and all
Mm-hmm.
others are myths. And so
Mm-hmm.
science is treated as, or at least this is the recent I've heard, right? As just another religion, right, or another faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this animosity toward religion and the narrative of the Big Bang and what it implies, the narrative of the theory of evolution, and even this notion of or the non-argument that is often flippantly shared. Well, that's just a theory,
Right.
without an understanding of, well, what does theory mean, right, in scientific terms, in
Mm-hmm.
academic terms, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What separates it from just an idea that someone has, right?
Absolutely.
What makes it a theory. But then,
Absolutely.
because that's not part of, that's certainly not part of the general education in high school,
Exactly.
and I'm not sure it's
Exactly.
always part of the education in the undergraduate programs.
No.
Well, let's talk about what a theory
So
is.
you can go you can go long without and earn a number of degrees
Hmm.
without a perspective that asks, how is information qualified? How do we
Hmm.
actually qualify information?
Hmm.
Um, it would obviously something that should be established
Hmm.
as part of the curriculum ongoing K through 12 and has been the practice in.
And this is exactly, and the K through 12 is one of the battlegrounds, right? Because this is
Yes.
exactly,
Yes.
how that anti-science ends up impacting our lives, because it's critical also
Yes.
to the climate denial. It's critical
Absolutely.
to the climate denial. It's also, it is exploited by these corporations because they reject the science
Absolutely.
that the regulatory agencies rely on, right,
Right.
to show
Right.
the level of toxicity in the river
Right.
now,
Right. Right.
and the pattern that shows it's coming from your factory, right? That's the
Absolutely.
reason for this, and why it matters what happens to these plants along this
All
river
of that.
bank, right?
All of
And how
that.
that's because they don't aren't thinking about the earth as a system,
Right.
and that and where and what is part of the root of this anti-science. Certainly the magical thinking of religion, the
Yes.
particular this particular fundamentalist version of religion, um, which in and of itself is probably not the majority view, but it's certainly the most vocal, and has also been a critical animating force and served as foot soldiers for this right-wing movement during this period.
It's underwritten. It is
Mhm,
definitely underwritten. It's got
mhm,
right. It's got a the force of wealth
mhm. It has the
and
force of wealth.
behind it. even though,
Who are some
as
of these
all,
funders? Who are some of these funders? The Coors family, absolutely, major funders of the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation is at the forefront in a lot of the research and the academic the academic distribution and presentation of their argument for a return to really the pre-New Deal situation. The Koch brothers, right? So these the DeVos family, right? That same DeVos. So yeah, they're well funded, and I just wanted to name a couple of them because we know who they are.
they need to be
They
named,
don't
right?
hide who they are.
No, no,
Well, not all
and
of them.
right. No need to, and less of a need to,
Mm-hmm.
as they are feel themselves, because I don't want to overstate their influence, because a lot of
Mm-hmm.
this is, as I heard it described earlier today, an Oz effect, a Wizard of Oz effect. A lot of it is, it's not unimportant. It's not to be dismissed. They've got what they've got, and they've got the seat of this power seat. But at the same time, some of these things that are always pointed to, um, as for instance, in though Trump's election is described as a mandate and this, that, and the other, and is echoed even in circles and in among discussants who are not, pro, don't consider themselves to be pro any of this, right? They still describe this as, landslide, but that had nothing, having nothing to do with what the numbers actually talked about, right? That the win was a slim majority under very
It was a
artificial
slim
conditions.
plurality
Okay.
because it wasn't even
Under
a majority.
Okay, fair. I understand. I got you. But the point being, this kind of misrepresentation of the popularity of these ideas and this set of values, right? That
Mm-hmm.
happened with Reagan as well. There was a big promotion of the notion of neoconservatism and in fashion and in all these kinds of things, um, and in popular television, in the comic sphere, the this kind of denigration of the people who held values and lifestyles that are associated with the 60s and 70s and whatnot, those kinds of things. But um I think what I was trying to get at, um or get to, was that, yeah, they rest a lot on, again these perceptions, um and something I've been hearing, for a long time, is, as people have been trying to sound various alarms, um probably for 30 years, sounding various alarms, this conversation about, um, what they call neo-feudalism. They've been talking about, the return of power relations, um, where there is you know, whether they've called it have or have not, have and have not, um, and or whether they're talking about, or specifically talking about, corporate rule and the rule of the corporate class, which is becoming now, in this current conversation, the rule of the technocracy, the technocrat and whatnot, um, and cultivated over time, along with policy changes, in terms of how we get to this particular moment, with kind of other pieces coming in terms of this, uh, regressive, retroactive, reactionary politic coming to the foreground. In the 80s with Reagan, as we were talking about earlier, with Reagan, a lot of this is memory, and I've looked at some things, and so thus far it kind of corroborates what I'm thinking. A lot with the pro-life movement getting a lot of press, and yeah, they're active and they're doing their thing. And it also took up a lot of media conversation. There's probably other things that, could have taken up space, but that pro-life, anti-abortion.
The media outlets, the mainstream media outlets, amplified that story. These media outlets owned by corporations amplified that story as opposed to, say, labor-related stories during the period. And yeah, okay.
Okay, yes. I mean, I wouldn't have said it in that way. That's not in my knowledge bank. You know what I'm
Well, yeah,
saying?
no, yes, it is. The corporations own, own the media.
Well, yeah, no, I do. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I see how you're
Yeah.
characterizing that, how you're presenting that. And yeah, absolutely. Because I can remember, I'm in high school, so I was like 15, 16. And however this came about, a handful of us participated in some demonstrations, and the pro-lifers were, they look like they always look, in terms of like that intensity and that, and I remember we were going to this demonstration, wherever it was. It would take me some time to pull it back. Literally, it's 40 years ago. But I was trying to engage somebody in some conversation, and one of our coordinators was like, "You're not going to be able to have a rational discussion here.
Exactly.
And you need to keep your distance because you don't know when they might pop off with some violent."
And these people have, over the decades, attacked Planned Parenthood.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now, when at the time of Reagan's first election, the conservative Southern Baptist Convention, the very same, Southern Baptist Convention that had come out against desegregation. These were no liberals. The leader of the Southern Baptist, issued a statement in favor of choice. Right. This was not an issue that widely animated, right, what we think of as fundamentalist Christian communities, the evangelical communities, but that too was cultivated, right? The moral majority being a part of that, as you mentioned, right, taking advantage of the media, right, and at least getting the rhetorical support of Reagan. And being performative, right, in their demonstrations. I remember going to some folks at St. Mary's College in the Bay Area who were involved in how should I say rushing Planned Parenthood, their version of nonviolence, right? They didn't go in. They went in to be a disturbance, right? But I mean, being, the conservative Catholic element, right? Of that too, right? Because this was seen, a wedge issue. Here, we can bring in an element of Catholics who ordinarily at that time were voting Democrats, right? These were some of the Reagan Democrats, the so-called ethnic whites. The Italian whites, the Irish whites, the Czech whites, all the so-called ethnic whites at the time were also the Reagan Democrats, and often Catholic, But again, I don't want to, just enough, right? We only need a certain percentage, right? That to bring to our cause, and yeah, and even that has developed over time since the 1980s, that
Mm-hmm.
they were able to amplify, right, that
Mm-hmm.
issue and make it,
Mm-hmm.
make it a what they call, what's the term they used to use politically, a litmus test
Mm-hmm.
for Republican, specifically Republican candidates. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I
Mm-hmm.
guess, yeah, well, I mean, I won't even speculate about Democratic candidates, but
Mm-hmm.
anyway, I was just, in terms of this regression.
Mm-hmm.
And now that we are, I think, a full 3 weeks into the current administration,
Mm-hmm.
and there's clearly, and embedded in this DEI
Mm-hmm.
attack,
Mm-hmm.
DEIA attack,
Mm-hmm.
um, across agencies. The new AG reporting today that they're going to begin investigations on private companies
Mm-hmm.
who have a DEI. So they're going to make sure that white men aren't being discriminated against.
Mm-hmm.
Something that the Justice
Mm-hmm.
Department had to be
Mm-hmm.
dragged into doing still for
Mm-hmm.
Black
Mm-hmm.
folks and other
Mm-hmm.
non-white
Yeah.
people or white males.
Yeah.
The
Mm-hmm.
but the so this attack, uh,
Mm-hmm.
it is absolutely looking to turn back the concessions of the civil rights movement, the concessions
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
produced by the civil rights movement, especially
Mm-hmm.
in
Yeah.
as embodied in the law, right? The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, maybe
Yes.
even as far back as the Brown v. Education. Um,
Yes.
I'm not sure what Clarence Thomas is thinking about, but maybe even the Loving case, right? And
Yeah.
whether based on
Yeah.
the striking down of what they call gay marriage, right? But marriage
Yes.
between same gender folks, or
Yes.
that they should have that right also. The
Yes.
So that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at the same time, or and also it really is very much a result of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement,
Mm-hmm.
the mid 1960s, right? This is the
Mm-hmm.
period that you have the opening up of immigration and the loosening of the racial quota
Mm-hmm.
um, policies for
Mm-hmm.
immigration that increased immigration from the global South, what's now called the global South,
Mm-hmm.
legal immigration,
Mm-hmm.
documented immigration.
Mm-hmm.
But this is an important aspect, right? Because this is part of what's being reacted to, the so-called browning of America.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the rollback. There's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely a rollback, an attack on gains made by women
Mm-hmm.
in the workforce,
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
education and access to education,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
supported by cultural phenomenon like the trad wife thing.
Absolutely.
The again, very much an aspect of this religious fundamentalism that's cross denominational, right? In many
Yes.
ways.
Yes.
Um, so there's that area of the pushback,
Yes.
along with the overturning of the Roe v. Wade. Um, and I hear people say, well, that happened under, Biden, but yeah, from a court that had already been
Yes.
established by Trump. So come on,
Absolutely.
be
Yeah.
bigger
So
than
come
that.
on.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
but so that there's that, right? And as you mentioned that, I thought already, actually, even before that happened, hadn't they already gutted the Voting Rights Act? That
Absolutely.
Supreme Court.
And
But
folks
now you can
weren't
add to that, and then as you mentioned, there's the accessibility part, right? So that pushback, and again, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Um, Labor is on the docket, right? They are definite. Somebody's already floated the idea of returning, to child labor.
Absolutely.
There was some
Yeah.
notion some other day, some Congress person talking about, instead of school loans or whatever, right? These
Right.
kids ought to get a job at McDonald's or something like this, right? And
Yeah.
um,
Because they, like you said, they've been floating that for a few years. They've been floating that for a few years, and in some states, they have modified child labor law
mhm,
and
mhm,
whatnot. So, as part of all of these kinds of chippings away, these kinds of chip,
mhm.
chip, 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 chip,
Chip, chip, chip.
until they're able to kind of build in terms of overcoming the
Mhm,
common sense and
mhm.
replacing it with another common sense, a
Yeah.
deeper, broader, and just capitalizing. Like when you listen to, I was listening to Robin DiAngelo, that's the scholar,
Mhm,
talks about white fragility and some
mhm,
of, these other white scholars of whiteness, um, and talking about, you know, one of the things that she was talking about in the book and just in the introduction to the book was her experience as a what diversity diversity and equity trainer, person is confronting the definitely the animus and these very ready pat common sense notions among whites um, about affirmative action, about being put upon by this what is it, racial compassion fatigue, or one of these fatigues,
mhm.
and in just listening to that, it's kind of because research is equal opportunity informer. It's easy to kind of see the that progressive recapturing of the that kind of conventional ethic of brotherhood and equality and
Mhm.
whatnot, and using that resentment of the notion of affirmative action, to wedge, you know,
Yeah.
this kind of common sense, because again, it's not a pro intellectual society, so we're just kind of floating around in what appears to be appropriate, at the time, without, again, what I mean by that is, so it's not necessarily that so many folks are um, looking at the theory, the work, the academic work, the deeper discussions of what conditions equality. Some time ago in the discussion, when you were talking about the anti-science um, attitudes, part of that anti-science attitude is also social science, in terms of sciences that tend to support and corroborate, right,
People's
the
lived experience.
people's lived experience, and also the
Yeah.
notions of
Mhm.
what kinds of the social conditioning and the material conditionings of social outcomes and whatnot that really militate against these, and support rational talk about would lend to and support the a conversation about distribution of resources, rational distribution of resources, about what it means to thrive, that militate against the notion of a meritocracy, all of these kinds of things that are in these other realms, you know what I mean, that get reduced to this notion of, and we see it on television in the propaganda stories all the time. Oh, don't tell me about your difficult childhood. Not everybody who has a difficult childhood doesn't become a criminal, and all these kinds of things that are also anti-science
Mm-hmm.
assertions, right, and
Mm-hmm.
ideas. But yeah, so what it means to the task, of the moment is to, or part of the task of the moment, would be to go that extra mile, go that deeper layer, because in a lot of these YouTube channels and discussions of people who consider themselves progressive and or um, liberal or whatnot, and are like astonished at this fascist takeover that's happening at this, you know what I'm saying? It begs questions of the deeper systemic issues that are um, creating conditions for this to occur. You know, so whereas folks, and I think I'm speaking specifically to whereas a lot of these folks would be considering themselves, reformers, and look for social reform and go shy of radicalism or a revolutionary framework, and would talk about those things as extremes. There's perhaps a broader challenge to for systemic explanations.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on. Go on.
That's why this was titled, looking at or framing this particular attack on what what they are calling getting rid of DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I think it does matter to say what those words mean,
Right.
and really sort of actually the impossibility, right, of getting rid of diversity, right? That's just fundamental.
Right.
The way it has to reveal then that you are opposed to equity, to the value of equity,
Mm-hmm.
and in place of this amorphous thing called freedom.
Mm-hmm.
You aren't interested in equality in
Mm-hmm.
place of this amorphous thing called freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And no, you're clearly exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
So you are rejecting, and then when we add the A, yes, we're going back to the good old bad old days of
Mm-hmm.
we're not making the world convenient for you, even though it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't inconvenience me at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just cut. Just
Just
part of the
us.
cruelty of it, and it's just part of the rollback. However, I wanted to say that again, we called it an attempt to roll back modernity, because this has been these conditions, that is, the gains that have been made have been the result of revolutionary effort since certainly since the 19th century. A moment in the world, a moment in the history of the world, where
Mm-hmm.
it has become possible
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to dismantle hierarchies of all
Mm-hmm.
kinds.
Mm-hmm.
Generally as a result of the disruption that has been created by the emergence of colonial capitalism, that has been absolutely disruptive worldwide,
Mm-hmm.
including within the metropole. And now I'm thinking of Europe as the metropole,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
its satellites around the world.
Mm-hmm.
But that disruption, including within the traditional societies of the global South, right? That where we reinforce our own hierarchies, or have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and which are often exactly what the empire embraces, right? The
Right.
existing hierarchies, to reify those existing hierarchies, to keep us trapped in an historical moment, fit for museum viewing or whatever, right? Or living museums,
Uh-huh.
you know.
Uh-huh.
Um, but the revolutionary
Hmm.
possibilities that have emerged in this historical period, which again, in the long view of history, is just an eye blink.
Mm-hmm.
These last
Mm-hmm.
500 years or so, 600
Mm-hmm.
years, some people will say, one should count. That brings us to this point, right? The struggling classes, the peasants of the world,
Mm-hmm.
the various working classes as they emerge around the world,
Mm-hmm.
um, the the rhetorical space created for a discussion of women's rights,
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
the liberation, let's get beyond tolerance, right? The liberation of non-gender conforming persons, however that is expressed in the multiple
Yes.
ways it's expressed,
Yes.
of neurodivergent persons, and their right to
Yes.
live in many cases,
Yes.
right? Their right to just
Absolutely. To
to
be.
be, right? That came through struggle,
Yes.
and socialist struggle also,
Mm-hmm.
along
Mm-hmm.
with national
Mm-hmm.
liberation struggles,
Mm-hmm.
etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we need to go 2 hours tonight.
No, we do not. We are in that
But I
place.
think that,
Yes.
maybe we can pick up with this
Absolutely.
discussion on the attempt
Yes.
to roll back modernity and the
Yes.
resistance to it, because you're right. They are at the controls. And again, because back when Goldwater lost in the 60s, they began planning and organizing. But they weren't
Mm-hmm.
the only ones planning and
Absolutely.
organizing.
Right.
Even if we are, and it is undeniable that
Yes.
right at this moment, even what can be called the global left
Yes.
is not as organized.
Mm-hmm.
But where the global left is best organized is in the global south.
Hmm.
And so, what's happening, and what can those of us in these internal colonies in the global north, and those who are
Mm-hmm.
maybe, descendants of settlers, but have chosen not to be colonizers or
Mm-hmm.
colonialists,
Mm-hmm.
what can we look at? And what are people doing? Because people are doing, right? As
People
you
are
said,
doing.
it wasn't a landslide.
Mm-mm.
He just got more of a plurality than
Mm-hmm.
she got. Trump got more of a plurality than Harris got, and only by, actually, the last thing I heard, it was 1.4%.
Okay. Right. Right. It's a
Um,
slither. A
and
sliver. Yeah.
the people who stayed home really made the difference.
Right.
And it's hard to blame them for staying home, even though we're in this mess, because there's no real opposition because of the compromising of what should have been the opposition,
Yes.
as a,
Long
as a
ago.
reaction
Mm-hmm.
to the popularity of Reagan,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or at least the
Mm-hmm.
seeming popularity of Reagan.
Clarity. Mm-hmm. The highly televised and
Yes,
and advertised
yes,
popularity of Reagan. And so, I mean, lessons hard learnt about complacency and um, comfort and
hmm
this kind of expectation as we hear repeated so often, and oh well, there'll be another one in 4 years, and oh, it's it just is what it is, and it doesn't matter what I do, and all of those kinds of denials of agency and engagement that perhaps come with a certain level of material security, a certain level of
Mhm.
like kind of a lack of volatility, perhaps, to really bring it home. Oh, I have some agency here. One thing that I did want to throw into this conversation before we close it out for the night, though, in this DEIA, it'll be interesting, what happens with that A part. That's in that realm of eugenics. That's in that realm of Buck versus Bell. That's in that realm of, just that, right? Social Darwinism as applies to the quote unquote whatever, the handicapped, the non-able, so it'll be interesting to see how that gets developed, because I think it would be probably most difficult at this point in common consciousness, in the public consciousness and
Mhm.
popular thought, to justify that kind of uh, rejection and othering of
So
people who are not.
just as people are preparing themselves to help defend immigrants, they need to be preparing themselves to help
Yes.
defend the disabled, the differently abled. That's
Yes.
real, yeah.
Yes,
And
it's real.
that language of eugenics is going to be really important to begin using, because several of these folks who are now part of the administration or
Yes.
part of the various foundations along with the Heritage Foundation, because it isn't the
Yes.
only one, um,
Yes.
that yeah, the eugenicists among them, and they are there.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely, yeah. Thank you for,
Yes.
so we make sure that we keep that in the discussion.
Absolutely. As what did he say in his response to the collision, the script that he was reading? Uh, Accepting of this, that, and the other, dwarves, the mentally disabled or the intellectually disabled, whatever, whatnot. So sneaking that into the
Mhm.
discourse. And so we'll be on the lookout.
All right. You
All
want to say
right.
good night, Tasha?
Good night, Tasha.
All right. All right, folks. Thank you for joining us for another Joko conversation. We expect to be back Sunday, right, with comrade James again, Uncle James, and we will continue this discussion on the rights war to roll back modernity. And certainly, again, not only here in the United States, though the United States is in the lead at the moment, but this is actually a global movement to roll back modernity, um, and the ways in which we can continue to resist. We at the Joko thank you. We ask you, if you're on YouTube to subscribe, to like, and to please share. And if you're on Facebook, also please like, please share, and spread the word. We'll be back Sunday, and then we'll be back next Thursday. Revelation reveals the truth. It takes a revolution to make a solution. That's Bob Marley. Peace, y'all.